Hello again. Okay, so this is the fifth podcast and the final podcast that effectively between them replicate the revision session that we did about Nazi Germany at war. And this one is focusing on the end of the Third Reich. In the previous podcast, we looked at the turning point years and we saw how the war turned against Germany 1942 to 1943. With in particular Russia pushing Germany back from the east and bombing raids by the Americans and British using Britain as a launch pad. And those bombing raids were obviously happening mainly in the German cities towards the west that were nearer to Britain. So, move on. Germany invaded. Because by 1944, towards the end of 1944, the war really came home to the German people. I mean, obviously, since 1943, they had experienced the absolute devastation of bombs being dropped on their cities, and obviously, certainly for 2 or 3 years now, it was really hitting hard on the home front with food shortages. But now it directly hit home on Germany with foreign soldiers for the first time setting foot on German soil. Now, when I say the first time, I think it's important to remember as well that in World War One, even though Germany was defeated in World War One, that never actually happened. In World War One, the war was always fought. Germany occupied foreign soil. And although she lost the war and she fell into retreat, Germany in World War One surrendered before any foreign any foreign soldiers set foot on her soil. Not true with World War Two. Okay, Hitler was not going to surrender. He was going to fight to the end. So the story that we have here is basically Germany being invaded from two directions. Okay, so just picking out the key points here as we go through. So it was the winter of 1944 to 45. German troops retreating onto German soil, and there's that point. For the first time in the war, in fact in any 20th century war, Germany was invaded by foreign troops, Russians from the east and American and British soldiers from the west. And the key feature is effectively the country plunged into lawlessness. There is few words to describe really what it must have been like for ordinary German people during this time to have their country invaded from two directions in this way. Now there's a map here that you can just sort of visualise, and there's a little key down here that explains it. So it was almost, in effect, it was a sort of three-way attack. Germany's ally Mussolini, the leader of Italy, Italy was invaded from the south, from North Africa, but the British and Americans going through Italy, and so they pushed into Nazi-occupied Europe from the south. Ever since 1943, the Russians have been pushing Germany back. You can see the arrows are already there, but I'm putting them in for you, from the east. A devastating campaign that, in terms of literally millions of casualties. I mean, the war in the east was the most deadly aspect of the war. Total casualties, total deaths in World War II were more than 40 million, and of those, 27 million of them were actually Russians, just to give it some sort of perspective. The leader of Russia, Stalin, felt bitter towards his allies, the British and the Americans, because the British and the Americans were obviously based here in Britain, and Stalin felt that he was fighting the brunt of the war. He was thinking, why are the British and the Americans taking so long to launch their invasion from the west? Now that invasion did happen. You can see the arrows there, but I'll put them in for you, and famously it's called the D-Day landings. But it didn't happen until June 1944. So the Germans then were being pushed back in the second half of 1944 from the west, as well as British and American troops advanced into Germany. And you can see the green area in the middle, which basically shows when the war eventually ended, that was the only unoccupied area left. because the war ended in 1945. In April 1945, obviously, the capital city, Berlin, which is there, and effectively it was a race for Berlin. The British and the Americans and the Russians, who will get to Berlin first, and that race was won by the Russians. Okay, so the Russians surrounded Berlin, and Berlin was occupied by the Russians. And at that point, Hitler accepted that the end was up, and Hitler committed suicide on the 30th of April, and the war ended a week later, when his successor, a man called Admiral Dönitz, surrendered on the 8th of May. So key features, and I've covered lots of these in these bullet points. Let's just go through. Russian troops were invading Germany in the east, so we've said that one. American and British troops were invading Germany from the west. Remember with that one to mention it was called the D-Day landings, okay, and it was the 6th of June 1944. Okay, that was when the first invasion, and Stalin had been fighting the war, pushing Germany back, fighting the war as he saw it, very much by himself. Although that was not completely true, because remember the British and the Americans had been invading, had been dropping bombs, had been launching air raids on Germany since 1943. Now back in Germany, you will hopefully remember that the Nazis had local commanders called Gauleiters. They were regional leaders, regional Nazis. Germany was divided into about 35 different Gaus, okay, and each Gau was the top Nazi who was in charge of that Gau was called the Gauleiter. And one of the key features during the last part of the war is how selfish and corrupt they were. They didn't pull together as a team. They ran their Gaus very selfishly and corruptly for their own profit. And very, very ruthlessly, they exploited food supplies, and they got up to effectively they were acting corruptly, and running them for their own profit. So there was no team effort, again, that was a significant reason why the Nazi effort was failing at this time. Law and order was breaking down. So from the viewpoint of ordinary people, they were very much living in fear and in chaos. There was a massive shortage of essential supplies. If the Gauleiters had been working as a team, then if one region of Germany had a shortage of food, and another region had an excess of food, then there would have been movement of food supplies. But they were hoarding supplies in their own region, so effectively food shortages was a really, really key and serious issue. And what then happens is basically you get a black market, you get illegal trading, you get people making deals. They're no longer using the proper outlets, so the whole rationing system broke down. People were just basically trading goods directly by barter, illegally, and obviously as the Russians moved in and as the Americans moved in, you get increasing devastation. You get the bombs dropped on cities, with shops being destroyed. Looting became very, very common, or simply hordes of Germans going onto farms and seizing crops for themselves, just basically breakdown of law and order. People in the farming communities, I suppose, generally did do better than the people in the cities, because at least they could grow their own food, and on the whole, bombing raids were launched against the cities and the towns. If you lived in the countryside, you were less likely to experience the devastation of bombs being dropped on you. Now, in the last months of the war, the Nazi Party created a people's army called the Volkssturm, which conscripted ordinary German males not of normal fighting age, elderly men and boys as young as 12 or 13 to defend the homeland. And so in particular, the final stages when Berlin was surrounded, many of the soldiers were Volkssturm soldiers, and many of those were literally teenage boys. Berlin, the capital, in the final stage of the war, was being defended by teenage boys. But the terror did not, in a sense, it got worse throughout the Nazi regime. People didn't notice the SS so much, or ordinary Germans, in the 1930s, but during the war the SS became a very real presence in their lives. So ruthless discipline. Looters were executed on the spot. That's called summary execution, without any form of trial, including children. So absolutely ruthless discipline. By the start of 1945, it was obvious that Germany would lose the war. But Hitler ordered to fight on to the end, so we've covered that point. And the war only ended when Russian soldiers entered Berlin on the 30th of April. Again, another feature, there's a recent book written by a historian called Ian Kershaw called The End, and it's about Germany just in 1944 and 45. And you have to try to understand that Hitler through propaganda, had built up a sort of a message that the Russians were barbaric, that they were animals, and many ordinary Germans, of course, had been brainwashed in a sense to be believing this, and now their country is being overrun by these hordes from the east, as they saw it. And the Russians were ruthless as they occupied. Hitler had devastated their own country, so Russian soldiers. Many Russian soldiers raped German women. There were huge incidents of rape as Russians occupied German towns. And the natural instinct of Germans was to flee westwards to get away from the Russians, because they're fleeing toward invading soldiers from the west. And if they were seen to be fleeing, they were at risk of being executed by the SS. So absolute sort of state of terror for the nation. And almost a relief when the war, definitely a relief when the war ended. So at the end of the war, Germany was a divided country. The Russians, of course, occupied the east, including Berlin, because they got to Berlin first, remember, and the Americans and the British from the west. So just to finish with the maps, so you can clearly see here in the maps, there in the east, the advance of the Russians, and of course the blue arrows show the advance of the British and the Americans, and of course Germany becomes an occupied country. Again, another map that shows the advance across Germany, and I put this one in because you get that strong sense of, if you look here, the race towards Berlin, and of course, as you can see, it was the Russians who got to Berlin first and surrounded Berlin and occupied it. So really the Russians on one side and the Americans and the British were not really working as a team. And towards the end of the war, they're competing against each other as to who will control most of Germany, because remember, they're very much the opposites, Russia being communist and America and British being capitalist and democracies. So the war ended with Germany literally being divided. As you can see, the eastern part of Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union, including Berlin itself, and the western part occupied by the British, the French and the Americans. The three different the flags show you. And Berlin itself was, although it was occupied by the Russians, was divided in the same way, with the Russians occupying the eastern part of Berlin and the British, French and Americans controlling the western part of Berlin. That was the deal that was made. Thank you very much.